I didn't see any system that helps that process. Somehow we're doing that very manually. And somehow at the end of the day, we know what we want. But as a competition, for example, we never know why we chose that plan. But somehow at the end, like one proposal get chosen.
Postpartum Podcast, Season 3, Episode 4, Yasushi Sakai.
Yasushi, I know you're working at MIT in the Media Lab. You're a PhD student there right now, and you're also conducting research. But where did you come from? You're Japanese. I know you're from Tokyo. What did your journey begin with?
I'm originally from Japan, Tokyo. In specific, that's in urban science situations, it's a huge city. So as you guys, same. I started as an architect. Started my first bachelor's in architecture. My first mentor was Shigeru Ban, which is, I don't know the impression of other people, but he's actually a very traditional type of architect. And not to say it's bad or anything, but I had a good time working with paper tubes, making these temporal shelters, going out to the world, actually helping out for disaster relief projects.
So you were there after the earthquake and with the Christchurch projects, potentially?
Yeah. So in specific, I was in China in the 2008. I still remember it was the Beijing Olympics. And yeah, we built a paper tube elementary school there for, I don't know, for maybe a month. But if you think about it, it's very different from what I do right now. It's basically hard labor, 8 hours, holding big paper tubes, waterproofing it, really knowing the details of what Shigeru Ban does. And so I think I come from that kind of context. My school was, just like the Media Lab, was built by Maki Fumihiko, which is another Japanese architect. And because of that, in the studio critiques, yet again, like a traditional architect, that was, I think he learned and taught in GSD. But yes, again, like I come from, in a traditional sense, from architecture.
But you say, is there a non-traditional sense that you're also coming from as well?
Well, so I think I was doing fine. And I like designing. I helped Shigeru Ban's his studio. I worked in his major firm called Nikken Sekkei in Japan. It's usually like all these skyscrapers are kind of designed by either two companies, Nikken and Nihon Sekkei. But somehow, before that, I self-taught to code. That was before my design career, or actually thinking about architecture. I was kind of I knew how to, I guess at that time it was Flash. I know it's kind of a meme within all these, the same generation, but everyone,
yeah. Flash is amazing.
We remember Flash. Those are like the earliest games you could play on a computer.
I think it was great. I mean, it's so many people pick up coding and using that platform. Well, I guess it was Micromedia and Flash, and yes, you do like HTML and PHP.
What was the first thing you built? Like, what inspired you to go down this path?
The first thing I remember was a 2-dimensional bulletin board using Flash. So it was kind of embarrassing, but that kind of made me go through all the, at that time, I mean, Flash was the front end, but the front end communicating with the back end, again, doing elementary database stuff. But that was mid-school, high school. I had enjoyed that, but somehow went to architecture in college.
Was it because you wanted to deal more with the physical world after having already kind of invested into the virtual world?
So usually in Japan, universities, you go into a lab or you pick your mentor in, I think, your senior year. And all you do is work under that professor. In my case, it was Shigeru Ban. But my university was weird in the sense that you can join whoever in your first year. So in your junior year. So
sorry, where was it?
It was Keio University. and um, I got into his. So there was a paper tube shelter, and it was weird. It was illegal, and inside the campus, like always. Actually, we had to tear it down because it was illegal. It was self-built, so we self-deassembled it. But that was weird for me. I got in. It was Shigeru Ban before getting his Pritzker Prize, and he said, "Oh, are you interested in design?" And said, "Yeah, I design. I've been designing websites and that kind of thing." And okay, then start architecture. You can do whatever if you start architecture because it's architecture. So as I was very naive.
That's a great
Yeah,
pitch
that
for
yeah,
architecture education.
yeah, so the moment I entered into that paper tube shelter, the first comment literally was my encounter of that capital A architecture. I was naive. I didn't know anything. So I said, well, okay, why not? So that set off to my journey on building things.
So, and I guess you graduated, you worked in architecture for a while, you worked for Bond, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how long did that last? And what was your kind of impression of the field or of the built environment broadly at that time?
So because I knew how to code and I think I was handy. So at the time, it was the early days of Rhino script. Maybe started the early beta versions of Grasshopper, and yeah, it was. I think it was very. No one could do that. So especially in small firms. And after when I went to Nikkei and Sekkei, that was always that was the same case, which they wanted to make a new division on people actually concentrating. I know there is the same thing in Foster's, but like a digital digital design division.
Mm. Yeah, for our listeners at home, can you explain what the implications of Rhino and Grasshopper are? And some people might know that Rhino is a 3D software that a lot of architects use, and Grasshopper is a parametric software, a plugin for Rhino. So, what did that mean, though, for the field when that came out?
I don't think it meant anything. That's the point. So that's the actual answer. I mean, the tentative answer is, well, I mean, in that case, Shigeru Ban was right. I was working with him, and sometimes you need like these weird shapes, and quite easily you can do parametric design. But did it really contribute to, I don't know, maybe in construction, yes, but did it really give some kind of contribution to the way we design? And it's a hard question. But for me personally, the more I do it, I kind of, not to say I was burnt out or anything, but I didn't see a big difference whether I would do Rhino or, I guess, I mean, technically it was fun, but I didn't want to waste. I think everyone actually who knows how to program somehow got in architecture knows that at some point, like, you kind of question yourself, like, what am I doing? What am I doing? Like connecting batteries? I didn't want to connect battery components. I just wanted to code inside it. And
you're talking about the UI for Grasshopper.
The UI for Grasshopper.
You wanted to actually control by actually writing out.
Yeah. So you feel like your experience working on Grasshopper and applying that in architectural design just limited on the surface level, where you cannot just like penetrate or like it wasn't like a tool to change like how architecture itself like fundamentally acts. It's just like treatment on the surface.
Yeah. Well, so in the same time, the type of education I got was from the generation that got direct influence from people really interested in processes. So I think it was in the 1960s or something. So they were students at that age. So I think that also affected my feeling that, oh, okay, so will Grasshopper fundamentally change the process of design? And maybe not. Like construction, I think it's different.
But I guess in a way, like, it has to do with how firms organize, like folks like you. Like you mentioned that when you were working in these firms, they were organizing you into these specialist functions for this digital practice. So the skill set wasn't actually embedded in the day-to-day design and operations of specific projects. And in a way, like the skill set's much more used for, like you were saying, like form making these weird shapes, but it wasn't actually used to change the specific ways of design. Like, did you ever like try to take a step back from that specialist process and say, hey, I want to participate in just the straight up project design process and see how my skill set can apply there?
Yeah, so I was fortunate that I was in a design team, actually not necessarily required to touch Rhino. I was like happy using, what was it? It was, so let me take that back. So I think it was AutoCAD. I still get messed up with ArchiCAD, but it was AutoCAD. Majority of the architects was using still AutoCAD, and I had a few projects using, like, as a normal designer, like a normal architect, without doing any programming. So, but I realized, like, you don't really, I mean, sometimes yes, if you really want to make a weird shape, that's useful, but it's not, it's very different from, I mean, I didn't need my skills. On the same time, I had in Nikken Sekkei, we all know like big firms use BIM. So I was the one who converted structure calculation models into actual BIM models, so that the structural engineers don't need to like manually 3D stuff. That was already kind of interesting, because that is kind of really tackling the process. Suddenly, I don't know, like the board members actually kind of advocate or push people to use BIM, and quite frankly, people, or maybe the elder engineers, were kind of reluctant on using that kind of new technology. So, what I said, why not just, you're making a structural model that has enough information to start off the 3D model. Why not convert that? It was interesting because the structural calculation program was programmed in the 19th using assembly. So I had to kind of convert that output into Revit. That was interesting, but yeah, I guess I wanted to do more.
Building scratched the itch. So what was the itch? What was more for you?
So what was more for me? So kind of thinking back, I knew how to program, I was able to design, and I was thinking about processes. So in software engineering, you use a software called Git. A Git is a version control system, which basically you kind of take snapshots of your code in reaction of any kind of vulnerability or new feature that you want. And we all know that there's something called GitHub, kind of a collaboration tool. But in essence, Git only does is just take snapshots. You can go back, you can branch out, you can merge. You don't really have that in architecture practice. And all you do is to duplicate files, rename it, and you have this final DXF situation. But as a designer, you are reusing stuff. You are going into circles. Not to say that's kind of good or anything, but you reuse concepts. You borrow concepts. You mash up concepts. So I think architectural media or design media is responsible for that kind of function as a whole. But I wasn't satisfied compared to how programmers actually work or collaborate. Because if you think about it, like the Linux kernel, you have 2,000 people working on, and you have every 6 minutes a new release, 6 months a new release. The scale, I think, working on like a mid to large scale construction, that's kind of the same, but like the fluidity of the documents, it's very different. So that was the moment I thought, oh, maybe I need to go back to school, think about kind of compare the processes. And I wasn't sure whether I would go back to design or planning, but that's one thing I could do. So that made me go or apply to the Media Lab. And right now I'm in a group called City Science. So I would say it's the single group that works on urban issues.
Which year did you wind up in the Media Lab again?
I came in 2000, so it's been a while.
Well, Media Lab is a very anticipated but coveted lab. If you're not in the Media Lab, you probably heard a lot about it, but you really don't exactly know what Media Lab is or does. Can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of what Media Lab is, what the compositions of that lab is, and what they focus on?
Yeah,
also, it's placed within MIT because it is a little bit distinct from other portions of the institution.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes we joke that Media Lab is in the middle of Sloan, which is the business school, and all the other MIT. So we kind of joke that it's in the middle. So it's kind of a combination. We do look into like surface level applications, but we also kind of have ties to the actual meat part of MIT. That's not offending anyone. But so one aspect is, yes, it is. There's a lot of startups movement going on. But the other is, it's basically a combination of four things. Maybe this would kind of, you might hear it very superficial, but we have art. So one group is called Future Sketches, which is Zach Lieberman, who is contributing the Open Framework project. It's creative coding. We have a few groups on art. We have design. I think ours is more design oriented. And then we have, of course, we have science, real hard science, including bio, wet lab, life science groups, and also engineering. And so I think we have 26 or 7 groups now. We do all kinds of things. Again, we're the only one close to architecture and urban design. So like we have tangible media from Hiroshi Ishii, doing all this, making these gadgets. We have lifelong kindergarten, which studies or which makes Scratch, like the programming language for kids.
So when you applied to Media Lab or when you got in, like, did you have a choice among all the different groups? Like, what specifically interested you about, I guess, the urban group?
Oh yeah, so City Science, we still have it. We still have this project, but there's a project called Cityscope. It's basically a table with Legos, and we use a projector and we map out data. With that's just a data observatory tool, but we have QR codes behind the Lego so that the camera from underneath can take pictures and kind of determine what kind of blocks is on. Based on that, we run
phygital sort of design.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, we can kind of assess like the impacts of that development. For example, like if we put lots of I don't know, high density residential blocks, that means you kind of imply there will be a lot of load in the traffic, or like subway congestion. So it's basically a tool for building consensus. And I was interested because, again, it was about processes. I think my proposal, or I actually met Kent before I got in, and my offering was, hey, in software engineering, usually people use something that controls versions. I guess a urban plan is also something that you can kind of snapshot, maybe branch out, use kind of those collaborative tools. So that's a project that I was interested in. But yeah, at the same time, it was fun. Like they still make, but something called the PEV, the Persuasive Electric Vehicle. It's a 3-wheeled personal mobility solution that self-drives for I know Minku that you're familiar, but something called ORI, the Architectural Robotics Project or spin-off, to make space more efficient by moving the
furniture project.
Yeah. So,
well, I'm curious. You talk about how a lot of what the City Science Lab does is to try to build consensus. I guess, for instance, with the Lego project, obviously within Media Lab, it has a certain identity, a certain style. I think because the City Science Lab is kind of unique within Media Lab, what is the additional, I guess, value that it brings to the whole organization and towards MIT? And how does it perhaps pursue its research differently than other realms?
So we get that question a lot, but I guess our group specifically, of course, it's the only group that focuses on urban issues. But usually, I don't think you would make actually like a 3-wheel actual working self-driving tricycle. I think usually you start by making simulations or agent-based simulations and kind of how knowing the impact of, or and again, the media is kind of facing outward in a weird way. So you do have this artistic or design oriented or maybe like facade-ish way of showing off Cityscope, which is the whole purpose, because you need consensus and you need to have accessibility on those Lego. Actually, like we get a lot of, I think the most popular questions in terms of Cityscope is why not just make it in 3D printing? Because it's essentially just blocks with QR codes. We choose not to because people actually won't touch it because it looks so precious, so intricate, and you don't want to break anything. So we use Lego, for example.
So how I understood it is the Media Lab's research actually takes it even further than the other academic institutions, where sometimes the research is just limited to the academic boundaries, where just suggesting a new idea and not really realizing it or putting attempts to put it out in the world. But I guess what Media Lab does, it brings the fundamental research as an idea, and then it tests, and then it learns and brings back in, develops it, and tests again. So there is this kind of loop of realizing and thinking. So
yeah, and actually, if you go back to your original description of the Media Lab vis-a-vis standard MIT and Sloan and how it's somewhere in the middle, maybe it's that kind of entrepreneurial aspect of the research where you're trying to realize something beyond just the sort of pure knowledge discovery and sort of move it towards maybe the realm of possibility. Is that something that you focus on in some of your work?
Yeah, quite frankly, I'm right now actually not struggling, but as soon as you have an idea and you think that it works, there is enough pressure that you make your own thing, do it as a startup. Haven't thought of doing that kind of thing, but so I do feel that like push towards that entrepreneurial spirit.
Well, maybe it is a good point now to talk about your specific research, Yasushi. So, propagational proxy voting systems. What is that?
It's a voting system that has two characteristics. One is fractional voting. That means you have your own whole vote, but you can kind of divide it into pieces. Two is a concept called liquid democracy, which is usually your domain is singular, which is if you're deciding in a direct democracy way, you're actually choosing A or B or like apples or bananas. The other way is usually you delegate your vote to someone else, right? So that's indirect democracy. Liquid democracy combines that too. You can choose to vote directly to a policy, or you can choose to vote for someone else or delegate that part. So combining those two, fractional voting and liquid democracy, I can separate my votes, for example, 1/3 of my vote, and pass it on to Minku. On the same time, the other part of the vote, I can kind of go to cast my vote to say, I want renewable energy, for example. Yep.
No, this is, I mean, it's fascinating, but it doesn't sound like research on the built environment. However, of course, it does relate to how we go about our lives, politics, things of that nature. So before you get too deep into the kind of explanation of how it works, I'm just curious, how did you arrive on this topic coming from Media Lab, coming from, Shigeru Ban, Nikken Sekkei, all that sort of stuff? It seems like a pretty big leap.
No, I think it's so for me it's connected. It's so this it's easy when I talk with architects because everyone goes through this notorious class called Studio. You don't sleep for, I don't know, 3 months or whatever the semester is, and you get critiques. Like you usually have, in my case, it was Shigeru Ban, like Maki. Very fortunate, but you get graded on your design. And design is multifaceted, it's nested, and each critique has fragmented knowledge, meaning that they have very different knowledge.
Definitely. I mean, it's a lot about opinion, right? Like, and people have different ideas about what is good and what is bad.
Yeah, and it is opinion based, but some parts are kind of mechanical, like the evaluation, like did you fulfill the FAR, for example? And yes, and you get critique, and somehow you get to be like the best one. And I think I got my prize for my diploma, and I went through all these. Like in Japan, after you get first prize in your school, you usually go out and like kind of go through different competitions for students, and that kind of dictates your career as an architect.
Time to become famous at that point.
Yeah, did well, I guess, but like the more I go through these kind of diploma project pinups, I really wasn't sure what the criteria these guys are actually talking about. And but I knew that design itself is complicated. So that made me push me, what's the right decision making? Like, so I kind of pushed back me a bit and say, well, how do we make decisions in the first place? And so it is, and then once you go through the diploma, now you as you're working as an architect professionally, and once you usually go through the community engagement process. That's also true in Japan. And you get suddenly yelled at about completely very different things. And also but that's very similar to critique if you think about it, because the participants have fragmented knowledge, and the issues are very nested, meaning that one might say very concrete things. I want in kind of this kind of tree, apple tree here. Or one might say very abstract things. I want openness, for example. So it's nested. The other thing is usually the structural organization for decision making is very stiff, which you only have a mayor, or it's not really flexible. So yeah, so those three, I really felt the similarity between me taking class, and in that sense, studios might actually be a good thing, but that further pushed me. I didn't see any system that helps that process. Somehow we're doing that very manually. And somehow at the end of the day, we know what we want. But as a competition, for example, we never know why we chose that plan, or what is it, because it was Shigeru Ban, or is it because the facade was pretty? Is it because, I don't know, the sequence is kind of good, or because it looked good for the environment? But somehow at the end, one proposal get chosen. Yeah. So,
or maybe the decision maker liked it, just plain.
Yeah, and somehow, yes, there might be a very strong or centralization in power that defined everything.
How much of this has to do with sort of the time period that you're also starting to do this research? Let's say post 2015. Obviously, the idea of democracy is very prescient on everyone's mind, going through certain elections, different policy changes. I don't need to go into them, and we all know what I'm talking about. How much of that relates to sort of your interest in this, and also maybe the increasing applicability of just understanding decision making in general? beyond the scope of just public planning architecture into a kind of wider, I guess, democratic process?
Yeah, so it's again, I don't think we need to argue that. So right now, it's everything is very polarized, and more and more we like binary decisions, and I guess there is applicability on that sense because as I kind of briefly explain about the model, you can split your vote to potentially contradicting entities, which I can say, right? So if I delegate my part to a person that I know that thinks very different from me, but I also push, on the other hand, specific policies that I would personally feel strong about. So that's effectively contradicting yourself. So I sometimes see my method as kind of a centralist way of voting. And the hope is, I don't know how I can validate this in the context of research and science, but the hope is through what I'm doing, I can have more, nuance is an easy word, but kind of contradicting voting behaviors, and then start from that to have more, better or rich conversations.
We want to incentivize personal contradictions so that we can also potentially have, agree to disagree more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, I again, like I don't think we need to kind of go over all these social media networks are kind of trying to divide us. I can say that although I don't know how to kind of validate or prove that yet, yeah, it's kind of counteracting that. And we also see that in community engagement meetings also, like there's no point if the other side, we know that the other side is, if we know that they won't change their opinion, we don't need that community engagement in the first place.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit performative,
so
maybe, in that case.
Yeah.
Now I'm like starting to connect the dots on like you earlier when you talked about Git and how it's kind of this collaboration infrastructure for software and how you can get like thousands of people to contribute to this one thing that kind of moves forward as a process, and how you talked about design and how it's unclear how decisions get made, but through this kind of process, all these conflicting opinions can come together and bring something into the world, and how now there's kind of this level of tribalism, opinionation, but in a way, there's a missing infrastructure for individuals to express their preference in a way that's not polarized. How does your research kind of start to build this kind of infrastructure for folks to express their preference on what gets built and what gets put into the world?
So the phase of my research is, right, I just modeled it. So there's lots of implications of so in order to go to the actual built environment, or even go into this community engagement and validate whether that would actually affect how people show their preference is interesting. But I think it's kind of, I'm starting to do that. But so for the small experiments that I've been doing is that so one thing interesting is that if the topic is very foreign to the participants, usually they would delegate first to someone. So you would see the network of the trust network very centralized. And then I say, oh, you guys, it looks like one person has very strong power on deciding. Do you think that is healthy? And from that, the network kind of breaks off and tries to kind of touch into more direct policy movement. I guess just by that, I do see people changing. Again, it's going back to Git, so it's kind of version controlled voting behaviors that change. And if that happens in a kind of in a broader scale, I would really much like to see that. But what I'm thinking right now is, so for every community engagement processes, I do that kind of small survey at the end, so we see like the direction, or whether how it's so if people are just delegating to this one guy, that means it's either that person actually has a lot of power, or the the participants doesn't have any clue about the process. So that's already kind of, I think, valuable indicator to start the next community engagement. So that might lead to change. But
I see it also another way of expanding it, because when you look at the community, how the community engagement processes work, like it's basically a meeting that the city and the developer hosts, and whoever shows up can talk about it. And if you see who shows up, they are mostly naysayers from my experience. Like they are mostly NIMBYs, and if they have a strong opposition, it's more incentivized to show up in those meetings. And and these meetings happen after hours, like 6, 7, 8 p.m. If you support, like, you don't have that type of behavior. Even if you support the project, you don't want to go out there at like 7 p.m. and say I support. I mean, if you think about it in human behavior, I would just, if I hate it, it incentivizes me to actually go there and show and tell the people who are working on it that I hate it. But with your tool, you can already, if it's much more easier to engage, like with your phone or something, to already address your vote, I think the overall vote proportion of naysayers and YIMBYs versus NIMBYs will be more leveled. And that's already quite a lot of help and improvement in the building process.
Yeah, I think all of us who have participated in one step or another in the building process, going to public meetings, we find that actually the people who voice their opinions are not necessarily the ones who, they're not the majority necessarily, or I tend to not think that. It's generally the ones who are the loudest voices and the ones with the sharpest elbows, the ones who want to spend their energy, their time, and resources to actually, as Minky was saying, usually oppose something. I mean, it's seldom that you get someone who just goes up there to support something. So I do see that the kind of work you're doing is influential in terms of actually giving some sort of somehow some voice to the silent majority. Sorry, that's a little bit of a polarizing term, but like the people who don't feel as strongly about something, but they're still able to say this matters.
Yeah.
And also it resolves the contradictory opinions that even the people who show up have and talk about. So for instance, the often comments that I hear are objections to more density, but they want to see more like community benefits, like sidewalk improvements, more trees, and more parks. But they don't think about where that money comes from. Like, who's going to pay for that sidewalk expansion? It comes from the density. And when I raise these type of points, they just shut down. Like, I don't care. I know what I want. I don't want you to build more, but I want you to give me more trees. Everyone wants that, but it's not the reality. So I think your system will be actually helping them to realize that too.
Yeah, I think so. I would call it a success if the participants realize that they actually conflict internally, which is very normal, and which I guess that's why we're humans. And the other thing, as Minkun touched, so sometimes people say, "Oh, this new whatever model looks super complicated. Who's going to understand this? And this is a complete black box." But if you think about it, if you don't know or not sure, you can always resort to just giving all your votes to the mayor or, I don't know, your partner. So you can choose how much mental load you're kind of offering for that project or that community engagement. So again, as you said, if you have very strong opinions and somehow you have this amount of charisma, you can still be very direct and kind of state your opinions. But again, I think the majority, if people are not sure, they would find a way to actually participate in their way, in their, I don't want to say limited knowledge, but in their amount of engagement. So right now, I think the participation is already binary. Like, you go in or you don't. But I think there's a spectrum there. Like, in some topics, you're like very opinionated. Like, I don't know if you're coming from a real estate background, like you have specific visions, but maybe you don't really care about design. So
No, that's
yeah,
definitely the case we encounter all the time. I mean, there's some people who think the color of the building is terrible, but they like the form. they like the density, let's say, and they just wanted to change the color. And there's others who hate the density. They think there's way too many units, but they like what it looks like. And I think especially for an uninformed public, which, you know, their speciality is not the built environment, it's not development, it's not design, it's not landscape. For someone to be able to sort of level the requirement to understanding exactly how things come together and sort of reduce the impact of their own kind of opinion, or at least take it a little bit more lightly, I think is extremely valuable. Now, I do want to ask though, if you are able to split your vote, are you at all concerned about potentially sort of corruption in that process, say people actually selling their votes?
So this is going through, I guess there is a big discussion of like, okay, if you could sell your vote, is that like okay? Because that's normally, I think the norm will tell you that's not a good thing to do. But if it's your choice, maybe that's one way of doing it. Is if it's one person, one vote, there is a issue on something called the civil attack, which if you can propagate a lot of users, maybe it's just to log in, or you just register a random email, that will dilute the voting population. So you can kind of hack the system or game the system that you can kind of manipulate it. So I think in that sense, that's very technical. And there are ways to mitigate that. So yeah, I'm sure things will happen. But if you think about Cambridge participatory budgeting, I don't know how that system actually holds integrity of the vote, because it's actually special, because if you're in Cambridge, the Cambridge participatory project or event, you don't actually need to be a citizen. You can be a resident. And if you're 12 years old, you can vote. So that means it's very hard to actually validate whether you're a citizen, you're a resident, or you're even 12 years old.
My partner, Sue, in the census, she's registered as a 3-year-old entertainer.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is like a lot of our identity boils down to data, especially when it goes into the political system. So I do understand that, yeah, sometimes there is still a lot of ambiguity. And maybe part of your project is actually accepting that.
Well, you can start to be really, really nerdy about identity and how like these systems or blockchain tries to tackle it. But at the same time, like I want to engage real people. So I mean, there is a practical sense that, yeah, if you want to do something called like a participatory budgeting system, somehow you just need to say, yeah, you have the system. It's not perfect, but
it is interesting that like the mechanics of the system not only can increase participation through allowing people to, you know, direct vote or delegate, but it also, I think, creates a really interesting feedback loop, right? You mentioned earlier that when people see the influences of their delegation, on the next round, they might take it back. So in some of maybe the exercises or the demos that you've done with groups of folks, like, do you more often see people change their mind because they see how other people are voting, or are they changing their tactics of how they vote in order to advance their original agenda?
I don't. So usually the workshop is like 1 to 1 hour and a half. So I don't think that's enough time to build up any, well, maybe so, but I don't really see strategic movement. But what I see is, so I kind of purposefully don't give that much time to the participants. Using the Cambridge Participatory Budgeting Project, I've done workshops using that topic, but I only give like 2 minutes to go through 20 options. That's impossible. So like usually, but in the next phase, I give 3 minutes within rating 4 categories. So that's very, very easy compared to the first phase. So what typically happens is people just delegate to the easiest one, and then they gradually build up knowledge. So that's the dominant movement of behavioral change. But I think it's a good thing because they're learning. Well, so the other thing the system calculates is what's the most influential node or entity or delegate. So that means in that decision-making process, which node or which group or which policy, which category of policy if you attack it, how to kill that kind of the decision-making power. So if one group holds the majority of the delegated votes, if you're a country and if you're trying to attack some kind of using intel, that's the division you want to go get at. But yeah, again, like going back to your question, if we do it long enough, I'm really curious what would happen if we do it kind of in an elongated phase. Would people actually start to strategize? Because in social choice theory, it's very hard to create a system that is anti-strategic proof. So eventually,
why is that exactly?
There is proofs, mathematical proofs that well, in a nutshell, it says that you can't really create a voting or a aggregation rule, how you count votes, or the method of this electoral voting system. There isn't any way that you can get away with strategic voting. I mean, the easiest example is if you know that the candidate that you're pushing won't go through, you actually don't vote for that favorite candidate, but you vote for the second one, so that you have high chances to, right? So that kind of strategic voting, that happens a lot, I think, practically. And I wouldn't be surprised if my system is also vulnerable on that, because I think it's human nature.
Yeah,
it's an upgrade over our current system where you only do have two choices.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I think your system and the algorithm can be applied to even larger problems, of societal problems, even larger than architecture of the built environment. So that makes me curious. Like, where are you planning to take this after Media Lab, or are you planning to go solo or try to apply it into actual businesses?
So it's weird for me, but right off you start this conversation that I kind of was in this two-dimensional way of doing one hand computer science or engineering and then one hand doing design. Even though the voting model could be applied to whatever, if it's collective decision-making, I can apply it. But I still think that I want to apply in some kind of decision-making process for the built environment. So I guess naturally it would be community engagement meetings, but it might be fun that maybe there's enough space for one architectural firm that has that decision-making model embedded in it. It doesn't have like a particular architect style, but it's a combination of people inside that. So it's kind of my personal revenge to Shigeru Ban and Maki Fumiko or like Toyoito and just say, hey, look, I just mashed you guys up and I got a competition. So what do you
let's do it.
have in mind?
Well, I think it's so interesting because the name of our podcast is Most Modern. It's kind of because we don't have a name for the era that we're in right now. And a lot of critique of the modernist movement was that it was sole decision makers who are deciding exactly what large swaths of cities, towns, countries look like. I do kind of agree with you that we are sort of in a moment where having a way for understanding large-scale decision-making across large populations would be extremely beneficial, not only to develop the kind of world that we want to inhabit, but also to develop the world that we need to inhabit, given the pressures facing a lot of things, sustainability, climate change, economic disparities and such. You come from Japan, but you've been living in the States for a while. Do you feel like there is an ideal territory or geography for this to be applied to, given either the natural differences between the two places or even other places, or also the political differences?
If the system is capable of mashing up different parts or like mix matching different concepts into one, naturally it would be places with lots of character. So I know this might be not a surprising fact, but places that has character like New York or Tokyo in a sense. But usually in the urban context, you have certain characters, I hope. Not all cities, I know, but
you mean that they're
those
unique, or they have
unique districts?
Okay.
Whether it's, I don't know, the facades or that unique culture context. If one half is, I don't know, the Asian community in one half is, I don't know, the garment district people. If we have a community engagement, or if we have a firm combine those two cultures, we might have some kind of conceptual mix match. That would be more, I would like to see that kind of thing, or rather kind of blending two dull things.
You can even bring in the communities to be engaged in the design process, so that it can be more fluid, rather than having an architect decide and then just show it and get comments. Maybe that can also be an applicable area.
Well, but that brings up an interesting question, which is, would there be anybody afraid of learning this information? I imagine there might be some people who don't want to reveal kind of what people think.
Yes, and I think sometimes it will hurt. And what if somehow, like, the person that was loud and kind of mighty finds out that he's not influential? That might be a good thing in one side, but maybe
so it becomes a question of power in a way too, which I think inherently we're all dealing with in the built environment. Who gets to decide what goes where and how does it come together?
Yeah, but I would argue, like, right now the technical scene, like using, I don't know, the blockchain or the Web3 movement, it's very naive towards this decentralization of everything should be all flat. And I like that concept, but I think, historically, like, human beings, we every time we build something decentralized, we somehow built on top of that layer a very centralized system, and we kind of break it down. Like, this is the end, this kind of tandem cycle. So it's naive to stick to one power structure or organizational structure. And again, going back to history, really bad things happen if these two, a very centralized, I don't know, like an entity, and a very flat structure organization clashes. That is a lot of casualties. So we see that every time. So, but there are very few examples that transition was very fluid and smooth, and we don't have that much of a problem. So again, another hope of me doing this is, if in one hand, one neighborhood, very flat, they had very strong opinions and they're very strong NIMBYs, but they somehow change the organizational structure, so they have like small mountains of organizational structures, or maybe small tribal leaders that recognize different values. So it's true, Alex said, it is all about power structures, but my claim is I don't want to stick to one form. It's the important part is how you smoothly transition into one. So if there's a very strong architect, I can still use what I have. And if he's worth that delegation, he will survive.
Well, I think it's fascinating simply because we've been in meetings with either you're the architect working with the developer and you disagree over what you think is important, what's valued, or you're in a public meeting and you disagree with the planners, or you disagree with the citizens. Like, building consensus is just so difficult these days, and a lot of it has to do with our own image of ourselves and our self-worth and our own expertise. But living in a society really does mean sort of compromising sometimes and coming together. And part of, I think, one of the issues that we face in the built environment is that so much of it takes so much like precise expertise and perspective and understanding of that one process, whether it's design, whether it's implementation, whether it's construction, that it is very hard sometimes to see other people's perspectives. So any tool that can be used to make that more not only available, but also just more acceptable, to sort of humble ourselves as a society, I think this has profound implications. And I really do look forward to seeing how this can be applied moving forward.
So usually this is media's responsibility, I think. But it's not, we don't need to go over how.
Well, it may be time for somebody else to give it a shot, I guess, if that's what you're saying, because I think there is, media has limitations for sure right now, and especially with the changes in technology that allow us to do other things. I mean, there's some other kind of handicaps that media now is confronted with. But
design media also, like, is that working also too? Like, even not just like big general media. is it working is it forgiving enough for example, for architecture to change their minds or like change their style? Because if it's, in that sense, Git is really good. Like, the majority of the time you're kind of reacting to whatever bug or whatever vulnerability. You don't really have, like, it's usually like the first like design phase that you kind of nail the concept of the software. But anyway, it's like you can change it. Software is like living. You
Right.
kind of is design media kind of helping that out for the industry. And I don't know how to measure that, but I don't really see. Usually, it tries to categorize that. Okay, if you're, I don't know, a modernist, you are a modernist, and if you do something outside, you're usually kind of discouraged to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about like what kind of infrastructure we want for that.
Yeah, the systems that underlie everything that we do are still quite important. And, Yasushi, I think that our listeners would really be interested in some of the work you've discussed. So is there a place that they can find out more, or do you have anything coming out on the horizon?
Yeah, so Media Lab has, this is quite internal, but we have a event called the members event. Unfortunately, that is a private event, but that's the timing that we upload our project pages. So there will be links to kind of further find out about what I'm doing using this mathematical model. And hopefully there will be a kind of a demo app that you can try it, create your own sessions or topics and create teams and have a voting session. This is what I've been using for my personal small workshops. But I think it's mature enough that I can make it public, so we can use it to any kind of collective decision making. So I think that the best example is the design dinner in your family. Start with that, but
the ultimate question: what to
eat?
It's fascinating that how people actually decide what to eat, and we are very, very flexible on the options. We propose very different levels. Like, is it a genre or a kind of a specific geographical region, or is it a type of franchise, or is it a dish? It's very rich, but I don't see any system online or a web app that actually does that, or that has that kind of resolution.
You would save a lot of marriages and relationships if you found something.
Well, I just delegate, so.
Yeah, I mean, this decision making, right? A lot of times it's a kind of fundamental human contradiction. We want to be able to make decisions, but a lot of times we're afraid of actually making them ourselves.
And quite frankly, the more you make decisions, the more you are actually you're richer, right? So like the more you make decisions, that's typically an indication that how much wealth you're aggregating also. So decisions are some kind of indication that, or maybe delegation is some way to measure.
It's fascinating, especially as there's so many unanswered questions moving forward about, I think generally speaking, a lot of people, we try to form consensus about what we should do, but even the question of how we should do it, how we should implement it, how it should affect each other, that's fundamentally complicated and oftentimes very personal and related to all different types of factors. And especially living, in a place like the United States, which is a pluralistic society with people from different backgrounds, different experiences, there needs to be a way to form consensus while incorporating different people's opinions.
But I would be honest that my system also has limitations, which at the end of the day, the system won't know beforehand what level people want to decide decision. Is it like a plan, or is it the specific tile of the facade? The system won't be able to determine that. So that would still be manual. And most of the times as a group, we don't know which resolution or which decisions we actually want to make when we start the conversation. So
that's good.
That's another.
There's still some room for architects to decide.
Some room for for nuance and art and emotion and all those sorts of things too. We talked before about your work. That's how we got you on the podcast. But just to hear it another time and kind of from a lot of the implications of the work is just completely fascinating. And Thank you so much for joining us in the conversation. I hope that people listen to this and are inspired by not only how one can move through a sort of career in the built environment and move through different phases and try new things, but also how they can really move towards a place where they can make some sort of difference. Because I think the research that you're doing, I don't think anyone can say it's not applicable to the world we live in right now.
Yeah, Shigeru Ban was right.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a great time talking to you. Yeah, I really hope more so on the younger generation. I think it's okay to not being able to. I mean, binary choices are not always a good thing. Like it's okay to contradict yourself. So knowing that kind of democracy might be a new thing. So I'm looking forward for having people listen to this.